Buenos días a todos. Les voy a pedir que pasen a tomar sus asientos para ir comenzando el seminario. Bueno, pues antes que nada, muchas gracias a todos los presentes para estar en este seminario. Y por beneficio de nuestro invitado voy a pasar al inglés. So once again, everybody, welcome to this seminar series. And in this case, I have the pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Stephen Conrad. Let me briefly describe the trajectory of Steve. Dr. Conrad is a scientist and resource manager with over 25 years on research, industry, and consulting experience. Dr. Conrad has developed his experience, through roles in municipal engineering and as a researcher, chair of the Resource and Environmental Management Water Research Group and associate director of the Pacific Water Research Center at Simon Fraser University. Dr. Conrad is cross-appointed as an adjunct associate research professor in the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability at the University of British Columbia and serves on the board of directors for the American Water Works Association representing British Columbia. Dr. Conrad's research focuses on the coupling of socioeconomic and engineering sciences to inform the quantification and modeling of system function and decision-making policies as applied to water, energy systems management, agriculture, and climate change adaptation. So with that, Steve, it's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome once again to Tecnológico de Monterrey, and look forward for your presentation.
Thank you very much. Buenos dias, everyone. And I want to thank Professor Mendoza for inviting me. I usually would stay up. I grew up in southern Arizona, and so for the last 15 years I've been living in British Columbia. My perception is always still traveling north, and so it's a pleasure to travel south for a bit. What I want to talk a little bit today is maybe slightly different than some research seminars you've seen in the past. What I'm going to do is give more of a story of a journey versus a very particular one research project, right? I want to start this journey by giving you the last slide I'm going to show you today first. And I'm showing you this slide because it sort of summarizes where I am today as a researcher. So as Professor Mendoza said, I'm a coupled scientist. I'm an interdisciplinary scientist. And so what that means is I work across disciplines. I look at policy, I look at economics, I look at engineering disciplines, I look at planning disciplines, and I try to bring all of these disciplines together into a coupled sociological, hydrological energy modeling. So this is an example of what that might look like when you bring things together. Why do I work in these interdisciplinary fields? Ultimately, it's the complex problems that I look at that relate to water, energy, food, climate, and people. They themselves are complex. There's lots of different variances and lots of interlinkages that exist between these systems that need to be modeled and presented and worked with stakeholders. Okay. So the world that I work in is primarily within the decision management world. And that world is very challenging, right? So when we think of decisions, we think of something that we do every day. We make decisions all the time, but the realities of decision making are that we see lots of complexity and there's lots of risk with the decisions that we make. There's lots of different nuances. There's conflicting objectives often between the decisions we want to make. There's lots of different scales, so lots of different alternatives that we have to go. So quick questions. Anybody know what the most challenging decision you make on a daily basis? Where to go to lunch, right? So you think about it. That's sort of the same challenge, is the risk that we have with different decisions. And so as decision makers, if it's so challenging to just decide where we're going to go for lunch, how do we make decisions around water? How do we make decisions around energy? So to aid these types of decisions, I work with what's called decision support. So decision support is really anything that aids a decision, right? And so it could be a spreadsheet, it could be a document, it might be a list of rankings, it could be options that you work with. But more often than not, decision support is some sort of computerized model or numerical function that really aids that decision-making problem. But within that decision support, it's more than just the model, it's more than just the spreadsheet. It also encompasses three really main components. One is that physical boundary that we're looking at. What's the problem that we're addressing? What's the consideration that we have? Because as soon as we change our boundary, whether it's within the national context or a regional context, that decision that's being made changes, and the decision support that needs to support that decision changes as well. Well, you have to have a problem that requires the decision. That problem, the decision aid support is really based on supporting that problem. But lastly, it's who those decision makers are that are going to make those decisions. So I sort of work around those three different components on the tools and the models that we look at, working with the decision makers and addressing those problems. So the world I work in is the water energy nexus, the water energy food climate nexus. It varies quite a bit. But if we sort of look at an urban environment, the two main resources that go into this urban environment are energy and water, right? And so we know there's some linkages between water and energy. There's lots of ties between them. So they're interconnected, but they're often managed very separately. And so while there are interactions between them, we look at them separately. We often find disconnect between that. And so I look within this world to try and bring those connections, try to bring those interlinkages to light, to bring the information about those interlinkages to those decision makers. So one of the really, I guess, sort of visual ways I like to see these interlinkages is I like to pick on California. California is a really great case study, and I don't know if they feel this way about always being highlighted as, as what to do, what not to do. But we see these visual linkages and what happens when water and energy interconnects, right? So this is a photo of Orville Lake in California during sort of the peak of the drought in 2014. And so this lake is a multi-purpose lake. It provides hydroelectric power, it provides recreation, and also provides drinking water. And I love the recreationist who said, I'm still going to go, I rented the boat, I don't care if there's no water in this lake, I'm still going to try to have a good time. But we can visually see the impact of drought visibly on the water resources. But also in California, we can see that visual impact of drought across the state, right? So this is a snapshot of reservoir conditions in California during September 30th, 2014. And the red line that you see is where the average reservoir levels would be in California for the same time during that year. And the blue is showing where those reservoir levels were during this drought. And so it's visibly see that across California, the reservoirs, these drinking water reservoirs, these hydroelectric reservoirs were below average in pretty dire straits. This changing fluctuation in reservoirs not only impacts the supply of water, but it impacts the amount of energy that can be generated from these reservoirs, right? So some colleagues of mine from the Pacific Institute took a look at what really happens with hydroelectric generation when you have variances in drought, when you have supply differences. And so what you see here is a graph that shows anytime that the orange color is above the line, you had more water reservoirs or water to generate hydroelectric power. Anytime it was below the line, you have a deficit in that hydroelectric power. So we can see over the last 5 years going on that in California that deficit is growing and continues to diminish the amount of hydroelectric generation they have, right? So those interlinkages are pretty clear. If this was to continue, California has to bring in additional energy resources for the state, and that renewable sources from water continues to diminish. So that's just a quick example of why do I study these linkages, because these linkages are important, they highlight this, but there's other really kind of tangible reasons why I look at the linkages between energy and water, and really kind of looking at ensuring the urban sustainability and bringing that out. The first is when we look at generation of water or water services, often those services are some of the highest using sources of energy. So if you look in California, almost 19% of the state electric use or 32% of natural gas goes towards generating and providing water services to people in the state. The interlinkage effects, the ones that you saw just quickly in the last slides, they're difficult to assess, but they keep changing. They change all the time because the climate changes and these interlinkages change, and that's an interesting research question, so I look at that quite a bit. Trying to understand these links because they're the most, two substantial inputs that urban environments have is very important. But if we can understand these links more, we can understand when we make decisions about water systems or energy systems, maybe we can address the problems versus just always trying to treat the symptom. And the last is trying to understand these linkages will help to explore what are the trajectories of water and energy systems. And to sort of highlight what do I mean by trajectories, I want to bring some research that was conducted by a colleague of mine, Stephen Kinway, and his group at the University of Queensland. And what they studied was if you make investments in water efficiencies, you expect that you can supply more water and get more things done with the same amount of water. And the same thing when you make investments in energy, you would be able to get the same amount of things done with less energy, right? And hopefully, as our urban environments improve and develop, we would see the efficiencies start to shift in both of those directions where we see a decline in both. But what they found was that there's not always a correlation between making improvements in water or making improvements in energy. We see the trajectories shift a little bit. And so on this graph you see, as your per capita water use hopefully would start to decline over the decades, you would want your amount of energy for the same amount of services to decline. But, so if we follow like Los Angeles, for example, we do see that the amount of water that is supplied per capita is declining. But often, we might see the energy increase a little bit, it might decline, might move. If we look at Perth's a great example where their overall per capita water use is declining, but the amount of energy that they use to supply that water has grown quite a bit. And so if we zoom just quickly on that part of the slide, we see that those interlinkages are very dependent upon the region, dependent upon the investments, and dependent upon the decisions that are made on the sources of water and the types of treatments that are used there, right? So I studied this to try and hopefully we see that both of these would be declining, that we'd see efficiency improvements on both sides there. Okay. So that's just a real quick background to get a little bit of help you to understand why do I study the things that I study, really related to these interlinkages. Which is almost a decade now, it's just getting old. I looked at sort of what would be the 5 kind of research imperatives that you would look at if you're trying to manage water and energy within an urban environment. And those 5 imperatives really are, assessing the methods to control the cost and consumption of energy, looking at the greenhouse gas emissions that are related to that, trying to understand those energy requirements for any new water sources, also looking at balancing the decision between new investments in water supply or demand management. Do you ask people to stop using water or use less water, or do you supply more water, right? So there's a big question there. As well as evaluating options for energy recovery or generating energy from the water systems. So these have kind of been the 5 imperatives that have guided my research over the past decade, and even going a little bit before this there. So let me just start really with these first 2 imperatives, assessing these methods to control costs and consumption, as well as the greenhouse gas emissions related with decisions around water systems. So if we look at some work by Jennifer Stokes, who looked at a water supply system, a water system, and said, what's the overall life cycle aspects, the energy that's used, in the whole life cycle of a water system? Really, how does it break down, and where is that energy? How much energy is used for pumping? How much energy is used for chemicals? How much energy is used for the operations of a water system? And what Jennifer found was that operational scale, you can see here in this sort of hashed across the whole life cycle, as well as the various different water supply phase, the activities, development, treatment, accounts for the vast majority of energy that's used in a water supply system. It's running the water supply, it's providing that water services on an ongoing basis that really uses that energy. So that operations side is an area that I looked at early on in the sort of the early 2000s, and saying, well, what if we could work with water utilities and develop a methodology for water utilities to use, manage their water supply system, but overall use less energy. And so this is a real simple framework. I'm not going to go into really great detail, but ultimately, when you're looking at how a water system runs, you would need to identify where the system is, what's the system structure, the model of the water system, but also develop a forecast of how much water do people need, right? So if we can know in advance when people will need the water, we could supply that water to them, and hopefully in an optimized way, like using less energy, getting just-in-time pumping, shifting the way we do pumping, versus a sort of a traditional way that water supply is run, where we look at water reservoir levels and pressure. And so if we have our reservoirs full, we know the water is going to be there. If the pressures are being maintained, we know that the pressures are going to be there. But maintaining high reservoirs or maintaining high pressure requires energy to do that, right? So rather than just maintaining these high levels, let's schedule that supply. So I want to just go to point to this part of the graph here. So within this small component of a larger technology control system, I looked at trying to forecast that supply, and demand need, right? And so early on, realized that water demand, and this is sort of really brought me in sort of the social aspects of it. Well, water demand isn't as simple as just thinking everyone's going to use the same amount of water they did yesterday. It changes quite a bit. It changes based upon the day's temperature, the previous day's dew point, relative humidity, wind speed, day of the week. Lots of complex variables come in that influence that water demand. So without information about it, I used a neural network, artificial intelligence, to try and predict that. So using historical data, I developed a series of neural network approaches to predict that. And so then would output, what the temperatures would be, the humidity, and more importantly, that 24-hour water demand. Once I had that water demand, we could then use that in an optimization algorithm to schedule the pumps. So just an example of what that kind of looks like when you bring that demand, when you bring that into an advanced control system. Here's some information from the Jacksonville Electric Authority, JEA, in Jacksonville, Florida, which is some of the early adopters of this methodology. And so the idea, historical here, is sort of seeing, this historical level, right, trying to maintain that water level at a given feet. But really optimally, if you try to maintain that level, you can allow it to drop down during these low demand periods. You can have the reservoir drop. And when you allow it to drop, you can shut off your pumps and save energy and try to schedule that. And so this is just an example of how they ran their well fields before the optimization, before using this demand, just really turned off and on based upon pressure and level, versus trying to schedule that through this process here, so really trying to level that out. And that optimization has a direct energy benefit, right? So it's using the optimal pumps, it's using less pumps, and it's using the pumps at the right time. Anybody do hydraulic head pressures in here? Okay. If the hydrologist would really appreciate the fact is you try to pump water, uphill. If you try to pump a lot of water uphill, it's not a linear relationship. It just doesn't increase by the number of feet. It actually looks more like an ellipsis. So you really don't want to try and push too much water over the hill because it costs a lot of energy. So another example, quick of that, is in San Diego, using the same methodology a couple years later, looking at putting this method in for them as well. Their structure here, they saw about 15% energy reduction over their 10-year operations within just the first year. So being able to schedule these pumps has a direct benefit in reducing energy. Just a bit of a highlight of sort of the example. So this down below is where they were previously running. They're buying water from Northern California, and then you kind of imagine exactly when optimization was turned on there, leveled it out, and gradually they were able to even decline the amount of water that they brought in. They could use their local resources more. So this methodology, which started back in the early 90s, I got involved with it in sort of the early 2000s, has been applied and commercialized for a number of different utilities across sort of Canada, US, and Australia. And what they've seen is, about a cost saving between 8 to 15%, as well as an energy consumption saving around, under 10%. Maybe not as significant as some of their other options, but if you apply this every single year, it does add up. Okay. So that same energy benefit also translates to greenhouse gas options, right? And so if I was just sharing beforehand that in British Columbia, our renewable profile is around the high 90s, 98%, meaning that all the electricity generated in British Columbia comes from hydroelectric facilities or wind or solar. Well, virtually no solar. It's not very sunny there a lot. But we do have a lot of water, so we do generate a lot of that. And so our greenhouse gas profile for our energy source is quite low. But if you were in another source which used a lot of coal generation, even a small amount of energy savings translates to a significant amount of carbon emissions, so you can reduce that. And so a lot of work that I've done is really looking at those points of carbon within the system. So this is just a bit of a schematic of a water supply system and all the different points of energy consumption that you see across the raw water supply through treatment, distribution, wastewater collection, even inside the end user, using energy to heat our water up, to cook our food, all the way through discharge, right? Every single point along the system has a potential for reducing greenhouse gases, right? And that potential is very based upon the energy profile of the source you're at. But one of the projects I looked at was for British Columbia. Since I mentioned that, we do have a fairly clean source of energy, that's great. But we also have something in British Columbia called a carbon tax. And so anytime we do emit a ton of carbon, you have to pay a tax on it. And right now it's about $50 a ton, right? And so that translates, if you're a water utility or if you're a municipality, any way that you can reduce a ton of carbon will have a bottom line savings with that, right? And so, I should have updated this. It just was passed this spring. But the carbon tax has gone from 35 up to 50, which makes this graph even better. But so I looked at all the different points in the system that you could invest in a water supply to reduce carbon versus going out and paying that carbon, right? And so, for example, that energy water quality management system here shown in the Central is a fairly expensive thing to put in. It requires advanced computerized system. It requires a lot of things. But if and previously the cost of that would put it a bit higher than the carbon tax, so maybe it would be better to pay the tax than it would be to use this if you're just looking financials. But things like storage level optimization or pressure management or leak detection, water loss audits, they all were below the cost of paying that carbon, right? And so following this research, municipalities across British Columbia have been looking at really saving carbon by making investments in their water supply system, right? So there's a link each that can help them identify the opportunities there. So this work, really looking at the centralized aspects of a water supply system, left out sort of the broader, so what about small systems? What about farmers? What about other areas that really interact with these supply systems? So, and the other thing that sort of left out was this key decision going into development. And so you're in your city's developing, your municipality's developing, and you have enough water, but now you've reached a point where your water supply is becoming scarce, or maybe it's becoming polluted, or you have to make a decision whether you invest in new water supply sources or bring in some new water supply, right? Well, opposed to that, you can also make the decision to say, well, maybe we could just use less water. What if we've asked individuals to use less water, right? We'd use demand management strategies that would, instead of building new water supply sources, instead of accessing or drilling pumps, we could just have people use less water. And so some research I looked at was really specifically around this deciding between these management strategies or developing new supply of water. And when you talk about water demand management, you need to bring in people and behavior and economics, right? Because it's something that, as an individual, we influence. So one of the projects they looked at was working with the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions and the Real Estate Foundation of British Columbia, very interested in that stakeholder side, was to say, well, where is the human behavior related to how people use water, and what aspects could we model, or what aspects could we know more about, so that we could really get a gauge around, will people conserve water? Will they save water? Right? Because the last decision we want to make is not build a water reservoir or not build a new pumping station because we expect people to use less water, and the next thing they know, they're continuing to use a lot of water, and the shortages continue, right? So we need to have a good quantification of really where different water users will use their water and how that can impact these investment decisions, because every new investment decision, for example, building desalination uses energy, or drilling a new pump that's deeper uses energy. Okay, so I wanted to bring a map of water availability in Canada, because we do have water scarcity in Canada. A lot of people say, well, don't you have 20% of all the world's water there in Canada? And in my part here in Vancouver, it rains 1,750 millimeters a year. So we do have a lot of water. But we do have parts of Canada where we do see some risk and we do see some scarcity. And these are in the regions which are larger agricultural regions, the ones that are using a lot of water. They're sort of our wheat fields of central Canada. And it's one little area that's just east of Vancouver called the Okanagan, which also contains the longest lake in Canada. It's a beautiful area with lots of agriculture. If you ever want to visit Vancouver, do take a drive out to the Okanagan. It's wine vistas, lots of agricultural, really beautiful area. But during the year, they do experience drought and they experience fluctuations in weather, right? So one of the things they do experience quite a bit, if it's during an early spring or snowmelt, they get a lot of flooding. They lose all their water resource early on in the spring. It melts, it goes through the thing. It creates flooding, and so all this water that they're depending upon in the summer will flood away, and that continues. It seems to be growing more and more, these spring floods. And so despite, this availability of water, by the year 2040, they can see a need to have anywhere between 25 to 40% more water to meet the needs of the growing community, to meet the agricultural needs. And that's beyond what they currently have. And so looking at the Okanagan, one of the things they do is, where's the water being used in the Okanagan? Where is the issue of the Okanagan? So a little bit more of the Okanagan. It's the desert of Canada, and so in the Okanagan, so area where they have really the least amount of water supply per capita of anywhere else in Canada. You can see that the annual precipitation rate declines quite a bit, as it would be compared to Vancouver. They also use quite a bit of water in the Okanagan. So their average is 675 liters per person per day. Quite astounding. So anybody know Mexico? 289? Does that sound familiar? 260? Yeah. Yeah, and so, if we look at, Canadian average, about 329, we use a lot of water. In BC, it's almost 500 liters per person per day. First thing I moved to British Columbia, somebody hooked up the hose to my faucet and started watering the grass next door. I said, "What are you doing? You can't use my water." And they said, "Well, you don't have a bill, you're not charged for your water." So there's not a lot of incentives in British Columbia to really conserve water, but that's a different presentation. But during the Okanagan, the summer average goes up to about 1,000 liters per person per day, right? And so really high water use. And the reason why the Okanagan uses so much water is two reasons. One, agriculture. Lots of agriculture in that region. Cherries, peaches, apples, grapes. Grapes don't use quite as much water, but quite a bit. As well as residential outdoor irrigation. So in the Okanagan, if you see anything green in the summer, it's because someone watered it. Otherwise, it would be brown. But they like green. We like green in the Okanagan, so lots of water is dedicated to those two sources. So those two sources were really the area of interest that I wanted to look at to say, well, what's going on with water demand? Because if we were going to need to reduce water supply, the water supply needs, we would need cutbacks in those two areas of thing, right? And so there is no historical data in the Okanagan that would tell us how people use water. We don't have very limited water meters in British Columbia. It's changed. It's changing. We are putting in water meters. But overall, we couldn't really predict that. So I couldn't even use a neural network. And so I turned to an economic approach called stated preference, meaning that if you don't know something, go out and ask them, right? And so this is a methodology that's used a lot in marketing, in economics. It follows a random utility theory that, in brief, any economist? Oh, so one, okay. So I have to be more specific. I was going to be briefer, but using random utility theory, the idea is that we're all rational actors, meaning that we make decisions to maximize the amount of utility get when the decision we make, right? So we're going to lunch, we're going to want to maximize the utility, the satisfaction that we get for the lunch we go to. But that satisfaction is not based upon an individual, it's based upon the sum of all the parts, right? So what type of food is there? How fast is the service? How long do I have to wait? All these things come together, right? And we have utility for each one, and we're trading off between them. And the goal is we make a rational decision that maximizes that value. And when we can measure that values, and we can measure how much people put on these individual things called attributes. And once we know that value, we can then predict based upon the sum of an individual option and all those values that come together. Restaurant, Restaurant J and everything that comes with Restaurant J against the sum of everything else that's out there, right? And we can get a prediction of what they'll do. And so if we could measure and develop utility preferences on how people use water in agriculture or in residential outdoor, we could then predict what they would do if we changed the conditions for them. And so that's what I did, is using this bit of theory, is working with these farmers and residents, is develop what's called a choice experiment, where you present them the options and then they tell you their preferences, and once you go through the experiment, you can measure the utility. So one thing about working with farmers, it's very detrimental. Never go to a farmer and say, we want you to stop using water. You know, that's like, the next thing you know, they're not going to invite you in, and you won't get to try out their really good food. So the conversation around agriculture is very important, right? So the conversation around farming in the Okanagan is probably very similar to what you have here when you approach farmers. It's about efficiency. It's about trying to get the most out of the water we have. And more importantly, it's about working together as farmers, right? Because all the farmers, they may pull water off the same stream or the same well or the same resources. And so that's what I did. During this period of time, the BC government actually was redrafting their Water Sustainability Act. And real quickly, the way water is licensed in British Columbia, the first person that asks for it has the right to that water as long as they continue to use it indefinitely above the next person that asks for it. So if you ask to use water in 1908, you have that right over someone who used in that same stream who applied in 1920, 1950, 1980, right? The challenge with that approach is it doesn't change with time. It doesn't change with communities. And so as communities change and the regions change, the same license who may have been a mine or may have been an industry that was in 1900s isn't as big of a priority, right? So the BC government said we need to develop new ways to allow a community to decide how they want to balance their water during scarcity, right? So that's what I did, is presented that to farmers, tell them imagine they're working with a group of other farmers to develop a drought response plan. So a drought response plan looks at a situation where you have a shortage. You know, so normally you have enough water, you have a shortage now, and so when you have this shortage, you have that conflict, you need to develop options and plans to address that. Elements of the plan may be reducing the amount of water that everyone gets, or allocating water differently based upon crop needs, or trading water, giving people say, well, I can't use the water, so I'll trade it to you and you compensate me, or something like that, as well as what it would mean for the overall environment sustainability of the region, right? And so you develop this drought response plan. The goal is at the end of this plan, it's enacted, and you've now adjusted your summer use to do that, right? But with all these things, what do farmers prefer? What would they do? How would they act, right? And so when you have policies, we don't know what someone's going to do until the policy is there. So this stated preference methodology gives us one way of measuring that preference. So this is a quick example of what a farmer saw. Online study with some outreach with Punjabi groups. Basically, they said, here's the drought response plan. There was some warming up information previous to this, so we just jumped into it that sort of taught them what was happening and what was going on. But the elements of drought response are presented. They are then presented 6 different choices, and in these choices, these levels are varied. So sometimes they will see this. So imagine you're taking this, and every time the type of restaurant changes, and you're switching back and forth between them, or the wait time, or the amount of, the dollar price for these things. And that's exactly what's happening, is using an orthogonal statistical analysis method, presenting the most possible options in the shortest amount of questions to farmers. They just simply choose which one they prefer. I also asked them, imagine that plan was available, what would they then do? So using that information, using a number of different statistical regression methodologies. This is a multinomial logit model, which represents the various different values. You can get estimates of their preferences. Now, if you're an economist, you might say, oh, I recognize that table. For non-economists, this table may look a little bit more informative for us, right? So ultimately, what you're seeing is a preference that farmers have for these types of options, all right? And so when you see a negative preference, it just shows that you negatively prefer that compared to the other options you see there. And the positive ones mean I positively prefer those as compared to the other one. They all sum up to be 0. And so often just this information could be very informative to decision makers, right? So if we look at these mandated reductions, first thing coming in was no farmer would ever voluntarily cut back on the amount of water they used. And what we actually found was that farmers preferred to have everyone sort of pull together and cut back a little bit, around 15%, right? So during drought, maybe there's some capacity or some change in there, right? And so being able to really cut that back was preferred over even zero, like not even asking them to cut back. The second one was, how do you allocate water to farmers during drought? During this period of time, British Columbia was really pushing for crop value, meaning give water to those that have the most economic value. So the grapes, the ones that you can sell. But what farmers told us that no, crop value should be the least supported, and it really should either be proportional, fair and equitable, or sensitive to the crops that are going to be lost if they don't have enough water, the trees, the orchard, right? So that information was there. The other big finding from this work was the water trading. If you bring up water trading to a Canadian, they automatically say you're going to start selling water to the US or something. So we don't like water trading. We always get negative about that. But what I found is that, when you really present that option to farmers, it's positively preferred even over not trading. Like, they want to be able to have the flexibility to say that, I'm growing hay, you're growing apples, can I give you the water? Currently, in a license that says that it's your water or not, you can't do that. It's illegal to give someone else water in British Columbia, right? And so that's information. And the last is, wasn't really surprising, is farmers really don't like to see plans that hurt the ecology, right? They're really good stewards, and so they preferred, a plan that would have low environmental impact, right, versus a high environmental impact. Okay, so that's just a real quick example of some of that information. I'm going to really kind of bring this up in couple of examples and bring that into what I then use this data for. So another one is, those are farmers. What about residents? So, I'm asking a resident, I say, you could save less water, but it's going to require you to make investments. You're going to have to improve your energy efficiency. You're going to have to, water efficiency. You're going to have to change your faucets. You're really going to have to do that, right? Or we could spend money. We could spend money and build more reservoirs. And so one of the experiments I asked residents in the Okanagan was that exact question. Imagine that you're forecasting more water. You need more water by 2040. We could build a new reservoir. It'll cost you $100, a household per year. Or you could make your own investment, right? And so using a real simple experiment, using sliders that change the dynamics, change dynamically as they adjust, it'll tell them as they shift and move and make their own personal investment, what does that mean for them financially? What does that really mean? And so what I found there is that despite our hopes that everyone would cut back, like we would want to cut back and not build any more reservoirs, what the residents were saying is that, no, they only want to really cut back about 55%. You should supply the other 45% through supply. Now, for planners, it's very important, because if you made a planning decision and went forward and say, I'm not going to build any more reservoirs, and then you hit that drought, and all of a sudden people aren't making those investments, they aren't making those improvements, you've just reinforced your scarcity, right? And so, so where they've moved forward is, well, maybe there's ways we can change that so people will be willing to make more investment. But one of the things they also found was that people are willing to pay almost 3 times more money for the water indoors than they will outdoors. Meaning that if they had a choice, ask me to cut back on my outdoor watering, stop asking me to take shorter showers, stop asking me to do all these things on the indoor. I'll pay more money just so I can use that water, right? And so this information to bring there. Okay, so this type of information, the other thing I did was ask residents about their types of lawns and the types of factors that affect the lawn. But ultimately, it provides some really good economic data with some really good behavioral data that you can make policy on. But I wanted to take that a bit further and bring it back to a hydrological model and say, if we enacted these policies, if we did ask residents to choose different types of lawns, what does that mean for the overall water supply? And so using the WEEP model out of the Stockholm Environmental Institute, this is a water evaluation and planning model. It's sort of a high-level hydrological model that looks at mass balancing between there. What I did is then, for the points in the model, these different demand points, like for indoor use, outdoor use, I now have data on what happens with this demand if we enact these policies. And so I wanted to bring back that data to there. So I think one of the interesting aspects about bringing that data back is in the lawn experiment, which I did not go over, but I just want to sort of highlight, is presenting these different options. They translate to real water use, right? So when you ask farmers to cut back on the amount of water they use during a drought, it translates to real water use. When people make decisions about their lawns, it translates to real water use, right? So this is an example of two different types of lawns that a resident may choose. Their traditional lawn, which would have grass covering around their entire lawn, traditional grass, Kentucky bluegrass. It would mostly be green during the summer. It would need about 630 cubic meters per year, and it costs them about $500, $460 a year. Or they could switch to another lawn that's traditional, a little bit brown during the summer, only covers half. This would cost about $120 per year. I could then bring that information from their choices down to estimates of water use and water cost, and that's the data that I brought into this WEAP model. Now, when you bring in these choices, imagine trying to model all the different restaurants you could go to and all the different options that you would go to. It's possible, but it's very difficult to look at and present, right? So I narrowed that down and said, well, let's just present a couple different conditions that are there and the two different types of lawns they have, right? So there's the baseline, we did nothing, we asked them to do nothing. Preferred lawn, which based on the ones that the residents said they would prefer the most, meaning 50% turf, water conserving, mostly green, giving me a little bit of money, doesn't cost very much, or an extreme water conserving option, which is the planners liked, which means no, we only want you to have 25% turf grass, water conserving variety. We're going to give you less money, but it's going to cost you less to water that grass, right? So these are different options. And then we looked at applying it for two different types of existing houses, those that had 50% lawn and those that had 75% lawn. So there's a little bit of a shift. Okay. So going back to that little equation I put up earlier, you can predict those people that would make that choice and then make that change. And so I was able to predict, based upon this preference data, that for the preferred lawn scenario, those that had, already had about 50% lawn, making a small change, only around 39.6% would make that change over a 5-year period. For those that had 75 larger lawns, almost 83% would make that change. And so that kind of aligned with what they said they preferred, because they preferred this, and so you would expect them to make that decision. On the water conserving option, we saw that less people would make a change. So only 29.3% for those that had only half turf grass, as compared to 65% those that had 75% turf grass. So the preferred is more preferred, more people are going to make that choice. Often this may be where a planner would stop and say, let's go with the preferred option, more people are going to follow it. But what does it mean for water use? And that's trying to bring that information in. And so what I found is that when you really translate that choice down to water use, here is just a profile of forecasted outdoor water use for the baseline for those two different types of lawns. So the preferred lawn would make a small change for 50. They do save water. For the 75% lawn, they save even more water. But, for that extreme water conserving, even more water savings are observed, and really quite a bit for that 75%. So despite the fact that less people would make the adoption, less people would follow it, the overall water use was observed for that extreme condition, right? And so that's what I really look to explore, is that feedback, bringing that information and saying, you can force people to make decisions that they may not want to, less will do it, but ultimately, what's your outcome in the end? Okay. So just last little bit of time we have, we want to cover this last little bit of work that I've just wrapped up, hope to have published this year, is looking at evaluating energy options within the water system. And so water systems use energy, but they also are a source of energy. We have that hydraulic energy, we have the biogas energy from wastewater plants, we have a number of different sources. Could we capture that energy? So a complex problem requires complex, especially when you try to say energy and water and everything together. It means that you have lots of parties you have to bring together. So this is just a logo screen of everyone who was involved in this particular project related to different types of energy utilities, water utilities, regulators, policy groups. And the goal of this project was to identify where that energy is, look to see where water utilities are going with recovering that, and what are some of the barriers and challenges regulatory that face that, right? So real quick, This is still kind of in review, but hopefully I would finish there. Looking in terms of where utilities are making investments in recovering that energy, both currently and in the future in 10 years. Currently, lots of people have this anaerobic digestion using biogas, right? Looking at options for that. That starts to decline in the future, and everyone's looking to move to co-digestion, right? So not only digesting the organics in the wastewater stream, but what about all those other organics that are out there in the environment? What can we bring in our organics from the food systems? Can we bring in waste agriculture? Can we then look to that? And so that's really the shift that we're going to see in the water sector is more and more co-digestion, more and more collaborations with those organics, those secondary organics that are outside there. Wind, geothermal, biofuel, these are really areas that are researching thermal conversion, heavily dependent upon the resources they have there, but sort of overall, solar should maintain consistency for the next 10 years. So looking at that biogas, one thing we found is that just an untapped resource that's currently out there, and this is just looking at the United States, if we look across all of North America, that amount of biogas to generate energy is quite significant. So just looking at the U.S., they have about 2 billion cubic meters of biogas that are either burned or just out there. It's not being used. And these are just the ones that we know that had anaerobic digesters, right? So it's a rough calculation. It's not a really good calculation, something that needs to be experimented on. But if we look at all the treatment plants in the United States, that grows another 3 billion cubic meters. So it's just a tremendous amount of biogas that's out there that could be converted, generate electricity or other sources. So why isn't it being done? Primarily, it's a cost issue, it may be a technology issue. Those that are really influencing, the ones that are moving forward, are those that have net metering agreements, meaning that the electric utility pays the water utility to generate power. They have an opportunity to be reimbursed, and if they can be reimbursed, then they will generate that. Or you may have some performance contracting that are there. One area that came out low, really, in the research of what people are doing, but I see as an option, is banning organics in landfill is starting to be a significant driver for energy recovery. The moment you tell a municipality that says you can't put organics in landfill, you have to do something with it. And so those municipalities that have these regulations are investing in co-digestion or investing in recovering that biogas. Because you just find that a city generates far more organics than we could ever apply to crops or do anything with. It just becomes a significant source. So, the main drivers, cost is probably for the engineers, cost is not a big one. There's also goals to really reduce the lowest cost of energy supply. But overall, the cost recovery goal management, there's a number of different drivers. Really, cost was the biggest. The rest of them fell across whether you had, sustainability initiative drivers or whether you had regulations that required it, or a variety of different things there. So there's lots of drivers that are out there and that potential. So kind of summarizing, coming to the end, is that work here is trying to then turn and re-loop this cycle back in, right? So rather than having just these energy and water being an input, moving forward, what if we could then bring that back in, recover the energy, put it back into the system, make it a more integrated, holistic process there, look to treating an urban environment just as a metabolism, enter that. And that means a whole new variety of research that I'm now working on, really looking at that system performance and resiliency through these system feedbacks, right? And the system feedbacks meaning when you make one decision, what does it do to the other part of the utility? What happens when you make an energy decision? What does it mean for the water utility? Vice versa, right? So really trying to bring those two together. This could be looking at questions around like implementing smart metering in water utilities. So what would a smart meter really do? We love data. Everyone wants to have more data. So preliminary work that I looked at data that's really quite applicable for the issues around here is that as soon as you give a homeowner information about their water supply, they want to go out and check whether they have leaks, whether the bill's accurate, right? So that's good because that's a significant improvement, right? Really addressing those leaks and finding those leaks, right? What I did not find, though, at least in Canada, was that giving people information about how much water they use doesn't really encourage people to go out and buy a new dishwasher or buy something new, right? So they want to maintain that. But And it didn't seem to matter if people got it online or in home and things like that. So really kind of looking at that feedback, right? So if we give them information, we can get reductions in, hopefully, or addressing leaks, water loss audits, we can reduce energy and get those feedbacks there. Another fun kind of thing is using game theory to try and address the challenges that stakeholders have working together, right? So you bring a farmer together with well, at least in Canada, this happens quite a bit. We'll bring an agriculture group together with a municipality, water utility municipality, and arguments will entail about who has right in water and things like that. So, are there other ways we can bring people together? And so one of the methodologies I use is called a water energy tournament. It's a simulation gaming exercise, right? And what this does, it puts people together on teams. It'll put a farmer together with a water utility, with electric utility, with a government regulator against another team of a farmer, water utility, electric utility, right? And one thing we find, as soon as you put on a team, you stop arguing, you start wanting to work together, right? And so it changes the decision-making process, and it's a kind of a fun environment. The goal there is then to try and have them work together and put together integrated water and electric utility plan. So some of this work was already published in 2017, and myself and Stephen Kinway just closed a proposal with the Department of Energy to run a water energy tournament series in the United States. So we're actually putting on, just as you imagine, like a sector tournament for different cities around the United States, and the winner then gets money to implement their plans, right? And so that's sort of working some fun there. Other fun game strategies I've used is throwing a bunch of Legos on a table with a bunch of engineers and planners and saying, okay, visualize, what do you mean? What are you trying to do, right? Really trying to engage that active process. So these are just different fun decision support items that I do. And then lastly, brings me back to the first slide, which is all of this information and different methods have really been working to say what we need is a methodology or a means to have a coupled model that already will model water systems, will model energy systems, will model those feedbacks, those system dynamic feedbacks. So when we do make a change in one area of the system, we can see what happens in the other one, and we can apply that correctly, right? So what I'm working on is building a framework for water energy interactions and linkages through a system dynamic model, modeling the Metro Vancouver area, and so we're working on that one today. So that brings me to my end. I know I ran a little bit late, so I do apologize for that, but I'm happy to take questions, and thank you.
Thanks, Steve, for this very interesting ride through engineering concepts on energy and water, then going to the behavior part of things for the decision-making process, and then coming back once again to the hardcore engineering aspects of all of this. So I open now the floor for any questions that you might have for Stephen.
I actually have one comment and one question. The first is that it is very welcoming the framing you have done of the theme within the urban system perspective. I feel the urban system gives an overall framework very useful to understanding the linkages between water and energy and the city. So I did like it very much. The question is, why is your interest in coming to Mexico? Usually we go north.
You go north?
You know,
yeah. I'll pick on my own areas that I've worked on. So I've worked across the United States and Canada and Australia and the UK. And a lot of the questions that we have there are related to retrofits or related to, we have an infrastructure. And so a lot of that work that I do is in that development side. It's it's the decisions that will apply to something new, right? And so that's a big interest, is really addressing that research a bit more and really where the questions are and applying that, because I'm an applied researcher, yeah.
Hello. How do you think we should abort these 5 points you have there in communication strategy for send the message who we have to care to link it and water and energy in that case, which could be a good strategy of communication to share with the people?
Yeah. So to answer that question, actually, that's one of the projects I didn't cover, which is called Sustainable Energy Management, and so Decision Support for Sustainable Energy Management. So there's an actual guide out there for the Water Research Foundation. It was published in 2011 that speaks exactly to that particular question, right? Because the 5 imperatives that I presented were sort of those research questions, the ones that drive my work. But ultimately, if you're a municipal decision maker, what are those decisions that you need to make? Like, what are the ones in the thing there? And within that framework, we even identified sort of the first step you should do, right? So it's identifying, reducing those costs, right? Addressing those water leakages, getting a handle on quantifying the energy within a water system. It's like those are things you should do initially. Then the second is establishing like linkages with the regional energy suppliers for opportunities for doing time management, and so it sort of works through that step there. Yeah. So if you're interested, I could be happy to follow up and send that to you, because that's sort of you can't really give a research presentation to the municipal planner. They just really want to know where are the areas they should be focusing on, what are the concepts they should be looking at, are there assessments they can do, are there performance indicators that they can look at, like how do they know whether or not they're doing that. Yeah.
Okay, in the next question, you just have talk about the consumption for people. Who it's the information that the people have to understand for doing actions who support the efforts with the academic sector and the other people involved for make more sustainable these movements, which the information we have to share.
If I think I understand what you're asking is for communicating
Yes.
the sort of the issue around water consumption. How do we do that, or who do we involve?
Yeah.
Often, and so that's a very good point, because what we see in British Columbia, for example, is the message around water conservation isn't the same you might see in southern Arizona or water scarce area, right? The message around there is there's not enough water, you need to conserve it because we're having issues. In British Columbia, often we just say use the resource optimally, make the value of it, right? But we're not, we're only have an issue of scarcity during these high summer periods where we may run out of water in the reservoir. So, you can't ask those people to conserve because they're not going to run out, and we can't even ask them to conserve because they pay a lot of money, because they don't. And so, the message varies quite a bit upon the region, right? And so the work that I've done is engage really the philanthropies or the conservation groups, or, the regional planners around trying to identify what message works for that region, what really resonates well with consumers, right? Because it's why they're doing something is just important as asking them, and especially if you want them to cut back, right?
Okay, you were talking about the trades with countries, and I just realized that with Mexico and Canada and US we have the TMEC, that was NAFTA for the English. So we have to make an effort to make another trade, but about water, not about commerce. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. Having a North American water agreement would be excellent.
Okay.
Yeah, and we have in Canada we have extreme conflict with the U.S. on the northern border, right? We have historical agreements on water. Dam management.
But it's kind of old.
It's very old, yes. And it doesn't. These treaties that were put in place around water don't address ecological flows. They don't address, transboundary issues. Exactly. I couldn't agree with you more. I haven't done any work on that, but yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Bueno, hello. Thank you for that. I really like the approach on how to approach people on where would they cut off water. And I'm just wondering what's the size of the scope you did of this, because I know we can have a big difference in population sizes. So I'm just wondering also how can we reach a big amount of people from different backgrounds and ask sectionally their depending on what are their possibilities to cut off in water. So I'm just,
Oh yeah.
yeah.
So the methodologically, the approach that I use doesn't depend. Well, it depends on having a significant sample size. So if you had 300 people, you probably have to ask all 300 what to do. So once you get to 10,000, 15,000 people, the approach works really well. But from there, it scales up to a very large size, right? And so the Okanagan region is 400,000 people. So the scale of the data that I showed was 400,000. And if I was to run that same experiment in Metro Vancouver, it would change, but not necessarily change because this different amount of population, but because of the different influences that they have there, right? So, that's a bit of scale there. Yeah.
I have a question. And how visualization impacts in the decision-making process?
Sorry again?
How visualization impacts in the decision-making process?
Sorry, how does disorganization?
Yeah, well, in your research, because I saw that you use different type of visualization for the decision-making, so how impacts? It has any difference if you use different type of visualizations or the infographics?
Oh, okay. So, yeah, I guess what I presented was a variety of different decision support methods and tools and bringing that all information there. What I've found, and so a lot of, like some of the data that I don't present to decision makers because the complexity of the data can quickly cause a decision maker to glaze over and to move forward. And so the visualization of the data is I think, highly important. So what I've done previously on presenting this type of information to decision makers is to either do a geographical visualization, like a map that would impact exactly where they are. So in the Okanagan, we showed maps of farms and how the different farmers adopt these policies and which water supply they look at. And so then people would narrow in on that particular thing. So they were less concerned with, that curve was interesting, but they wanted to see it visually applied. So my approach is the more visually you can engage, the better. And then in the gaming exercise that I talked about, we use a systems dynamic model that really is a visual feedback of where the links are going between each other that people can follow. Yeah. So I try not to show too many numbers. Thanks.
Okay, so, yes. No.
How was your experience with the energy and with the water and energy tournament? How does it work?
So good question. So the way the tournament works is it's a 2-day tournament, and so the first day, all the participants go through the education phase, right? So they learn about the region, they learn about things, they learn about terminology. That's one of the big things that has come from this water energy tournament is that we all have the language that we bring, and as soon as you put people together, we don't know how to communicate, right? And so energy people have a completely different set of criteria of language they use with water people, and we have to work through that. So the first day is all about learning the language so that we can talk to each other. Because fecal coli to an energy person means, so we work through there. Then the second day, when they split off into their teams, they're given essentially a technical presentation. So trying to make it as real as possible. So we have judges who wear, referee shirts that walk around the rooms. We have members of the municipality come in and give a technical presentation that presents exactly what the scenario is. And we have a governing board that they have to make a presentation to as they're doing it, right? And so, these are professionals, right? And so they work through the scenario. They get about 2 hours to work through the scenario, make a presentation, defend that presentation. They're judged. Everyone scores and works within the score. We have a scoreboard that shows how people are running. The more game you can put into it, the more the decision makers engage. It's a cognitive process there. And then it repeats for the second scenario. So the scenarios are all based upon the region, whether energy-focused or water-focused, scarcity, it's all regional. And at the end, we have, the scoring's matched and they have a winner.
You're talking about real problems, right, with that exercise?
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, so that's the idea, is you bring in the scenario that's applicable to the region that it's applied to. So in Metro Vancouver, for example, we don't do water scarcity. We look at transformation. So it's energy transformation. It's moving from a centralized energy grid to a distributed energy grid. It's bringing in water meters. It's what's applicable to that region. Okay, thank
Very
you.
good. So I guess that we are over time.
Oh.
So once again, I appreciate everybody's coming. And once again, join me giving a hand for Stephen for this very nice presentation.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Stephen is going to be here for the rest of the day and actually tomorrow. So if you have something on your mind that you might want to ask him or have a conversation, he will be available. Just send me an email and we'll give you the proper context. So once again, thanks a bunch.